Lily Parker sat nervously on the cold leather bench of the tech firm's lobby, her hands clutched tightly around the folder containing her resume. At just 22, she had faced more struggles than most. Her age, but she carried herself with quiet determination. Her shoes bore the faint scuffs of being worn too long, and her second-hand suit hung just slightly loose at the shoulders, but none of that could diminish the light in her eyes. This wasn't just another job application. This was her chance to lift her family out of the constant shadow of bills and uncertainty. The lobby itself felt like another world. Tall glass windows stretched to the ceiling, spilling natural light across polished marble floors. Everything shined, from the brass handles of the front doors to the sleek receptionist desk where applicants checked in. Around Lily, young professionals shifted uncomfortably in their tailored suits, their expressions tense but confident. Some glanced at her with a quick, dismissive look, noticing her modest clothes, while others ignored her entirely, absorbed in their phones or flipping through notes for the interview. Lily breathed deeply, trying to steady her racing heart. As she waited, her eyes wandered to the edges of the lobby. There, she noticed a man in faded work clothes struggling to steady a heavy mop bucket. He looked to be in his 60s, his back slightly bent with age, his face etched with lines that spoke of decades of labor. The bucket suddenly tipped, water splashing across the pristine floor. The janitor groaned softly, bending down to right it, but the weight was clearly too much for him. The sharp scent of cleaning solution spread quickly as the puddle widened on the marble tiles. For a brief moment, the applicants nearby reacted. A young man in a navy suit stepped back quickly to avoid the water splashing on his polished shoes. Another woman wrinkled her nose, shaking her head as she muttered something under her breath. No one moved to help. Instead, they gathered their things and shifted farther away, some even rolling their eyes, as if the old man's struggle was an inconvenience rather than a call for compassion. Lily blinked, torn between her nerves for the upcoming interview and the tug in her chest. Her decision came quickly. Without hesitation, Lily set her resume folder down on the bench and hurried over. Dropping to her knees on the marble floor, she grabbed a stack of paper towels from the counter nearby and began blotting up the spreading water. "Don't worry, sir, I've got it," she said softly, her voice carrying warmth and respect. The janitor looked up in surprise, his tired blue eyes widening at the sight of her helping so willingly. He gave a small nod, almost embarrassed by the attention, and tried to lift the bucket again, but Lily reached out to steady it with him. Together, they managed to keep the rest of the water from spilling, and within minutes, the floor no longer looked like a hazard. Lily's knees were damp, her hands cold from the soaked towels, but she smiled anyway. "There, all better," she said, tossing the last of the wet paper into the bin. Around them, the other candidates simply went back to their conversations or stared at their phones, pretending the scene hadn't happened at all. But for Lily, the moment wasn't about being noticed. It was about doing what felt right. The janitor paused, studying her face for a moment longer than expected. His wrinkled features softened as if he were holding back words he didn't wish to reveal. Then, with a small but meaningful nod, he whispered, "Thank you, miss. Not many would have stopped." His voice carried the weight of years of being overlooked, dismissed, or treated as invisible. Lily gave him a reassuring smile, brushing her damp palms against her skirt. "You're welcome. My mom always said kindness doesn't cost anything." It was a simple phrase, but it lit a spark of emotion in his gaze. Lily stood quickly, smoothing her suit and glancing back toward the waiting area. A few of the candidates were now watching her, not with admiration, but with faint smirks, as though they found her actions foolish. She felt her cheeks heat, but she held her head high, reminding herself why she was there. She wasn't competing for their approval. She was there to prove herself to the company. As she retrieved her resume folder, she whispered under her breath, "One step at a time, Lily." She had faced bigger challenges than this moment of judgment. The minutes ticked by slowly as Lily's turn for the interview grew closer. The secretary called names in order, and each time a polished candidate disappeared through the double doors, Lily felt her stomach tighten. She couldn't help but replay the scene with the janitor in her head. Something about it felt unusual, as if there was more to the encounter than just spilled water. But she brushed it aside, focusing instead on calming her nerves. She reminded herself of all the nights she had studied, all the sacrifices she and her mother had made to get her here. What Lily didn't know was that her small act of kindness had not gone unnoticed. The janitor, still standing by his mop bucket, quietly observed her from across the room. His expression was unreadable, but there was a quiet satisfaction in his eyes, as though a hidden test had just been passed. None of the other applicants paid him any attention, not after the mess was gone, but Lily's genuine concern had left a mark. While she worried about her appearance, her resume, and her answers, she had already revealed something far greater about herself. The waiting area slowly emptied, and Lily's name drew closer on the list. She clutched her folder tighter, her palms damp despite her best efforts to stay composed. The janitor eventually slipped away, pushing his bucket down the hall, blending into the background once more. Lily barely noticed his departure, her mind focused on the interview ahead. To her, he was just a kind man doing his job. She had no way of knowing that the man she had just helped wasn't who he seemed, that the encounter would change everything about the path she was about to walk. Lily hurried up the carpeted staircase, her heart pounding in her chest as though it might burst. The moment with the janitor still lingered in her mind, but the ticking of the lobby clock pushed her forward. She couldn't afford to be late. Adjusting her second-hand blazer and clutching the resume folder so tightly it wrinkled, she whispered to herself to breathe. The hallway leading to the interviews stretched endlessly, lined with framed photographs of smiling employees and awards that gleamed under the recessed lighting. She tried not to feel small in a place so overwhelming. At the waiting area outside the interview room, the air was thick with tension. A row of candidates sat in silence, their expressions stiff, their bodies restless. Some straightened their ties for the 5th time, others glanced through neatly typed notes, their pens tapping nervously against clipboards. Lily sat among them, feeling the weight of her own nerves press in harder with each passing second. She smoothed the wrinkles in her skirt, inhaling deeply to calm herself. Her chest rose and fell quickly, her palms clammy. This was her one chance, and she couldn't let it slip. "Miss Parker," the secretary finally called, her professional voice slicing through the heavy silence. Lily jerked slightly at the sound of her name. She rose to her feet, her knees almost buckling under the weight of expectation. The folder nearly slipped from her trembling hands as she steadied herself and forced a smile. The other candidates cast fleeting glances at her, some indifferent, others faintly, smirking as though she didn't belong in the same competition. Lily pushed aside the sting of their silent judgment and followed the secretary toward the tall double doors. When those heavy doors swung open, Lily stepped into the massive conference room and froze. The room was far more intimidating than she had imagined. A long, polished mahogany desk stretched across the front, gleaming under the golden light of a chandelier. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a panoramic view of Chicago's skyline, where towers of glass and steel glittered in the afternoon sun. Her heart pounded in her ears as she tried to take in the scene, but all thoughts came to a screeching halt when her eyes landed on the man seated at the desk. It was him, the janitor, or at least that's who she had believed he was. His faded work clothes were gone, replaced by a sharp navy blue suit that looked perfectly tailored. His silver hair was neatly combed back, giving him an air of authority that radiated across the room. Most striking of all were his eyes. Those piercing blue eyes she had seen in the lobby, they now sparkled with recognition and a hint of amusement as they met hers. Lily's mouth went dry, her hands trembling as reality crashed over her. "Miss Parker," he said calmly, his voice smooth and commanding, yet kind. He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Please, have a seat." Lily blinked, her lips parting as though to speak, but no words came out. Her mind scrambled for an explanation, her body frozen in disbelief. Somehow, her legs carried her forward, and she lowered herself into the chair, her heart still hammering against her ribs. The man folded his hands neatly atop the desk, studying her with an expression that was both knowing and patient. You're... Lily stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. She couldn't finish the sentence. Her thoughts swirled the bucket, the water, the mop. It didn't make sense. The man before her looked nothing like the struggling janitor she had helped. He chuckled softly, leaning back in his chair with a look of quiet satisfaction. "Yes," he said gently, his voice rich with experience. "I'm Richard Hayes, CEO of this company." The title hit Lily like a tidal wave. Her eyes widened, her heart leaping into her throat as shock rippled through her entire body. Richard leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady but not harsh. "I like to see how people treat those they believe can do nothing for them." The words struck her deeply, piercing through the storm of confusion in her mind. He wasn't just the CEO, he had been testing her. The janitor disguise, the spilled water, it had all been deliberate. Lily's breath caught in her throat, her chest tightening as realization dawned. Richard's eyes softened, and his tone carried a warmth that contrasted with his powerful presence. "And today, you showed me something I can't find on a resume, kindness." Lily's lips parted, but no words came. Her hands trembled in her lap as she tried to process what had just happened. The CEO of one of Chicago's largest tech firms had been the very man she knelt beside to clean up a mess. And instead of embarrassing her, instead of seeing her soaked knees and scuffed shoes, he saw her heart. Her voice shook as she whispered, I didn't know. I just thought you needed help." Richard smiled gently, nodding. "That's exactly the point, Miss Parker. You helped because it was the right thing to do." The silence that followed felt heavy, yet not uncomfortable. Lily's thoughts raced back to her mother's words about kindness, about treating everyone with respect regardless of status. She hadn't expected those lessons to matter here, in a corporate building filled with glass and steel. But here they were, echoing in her ears, being spoken back to her by the man who could decide her future. She swallowed hard, her heart still pounding. Richard's presence was commanding, but not intimidating. It was as though he was testing not her resume, but her character, and she had passed without even knowing. Richard leaned back in his chair, observing her for another moment, as though studying not just her actions, but the person beneath them. "Do you know," he said slowly, his voice measured, "how many people walked past me in that lobby without a second glance? How many looked annoyed, even inconvenienced, by the idea of helping someone they thought was beneath them?" His words carried a weight that made Lily's chest tighten. She could picture it, the polished shoes, stepping aside, the disdainful looks, the indifference, and then herself kneeling on the floor, paper towels in hand. "I wasn't testing for intelligence or skill," Richard continued, his voice firm yet calm. "Those things can be taught. What I can't teach is heart, compassion, the ability to see someone and treat them with dignity." He folded his hands together again, his gaze never wavering from hers. "That is what makes a person valuable to this company." Lily's throat tightened with emotion. She wanted to speak, to explain, that it wasn't some grand gesture, but her voice betrayed her. All she could manage was a quiet, I only did what anyone should do." A faint smile curved Richard's lips as he shook his head gently. "That's where you're wrong, Miss Parker. Anyone should, but very few do." The words settled into The air between them, heavy with truth. Lily blinked rapidly, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. She had walked into this building worried about her scuffed shoes, her second-hand suit, the imperfections in her resume. And now, none of that seemed to matter. What mattered was the moment. She had forgotten herself when she chose kindness over fear of judgment. It was that choice that had brought her here. Richard studied her once more, his piercing eyes softening with sincerity. "Miss Parker," he said slowly, "you've already told me more about yourself in 5 minutes than any resume ever could. And I'll be honest, it's exactly what I want to see in someone joining this company." Lily's breath caught, her heart fluttering wildly. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. The CEO himself was speaking to her not as just another candidate, but as someone who had already shown she belonged. She straightened in her chair, her trembling, easing as courage flickered in her chest. Richard's words hung in the air like a bell's final chime, resonating deep within Lily's heart. She blinked rapidly, unable to stop the tears forming in her eyes. His voice was calm yet firm, filled with sincerity that left no room for doubt. "We can teach skills, but we can't teach compassion, and compassion is what this company stands for." Slowly he rose from his chair, his presence commanding but warm, and extended his hand across the desk. "Miss Parker," he said with a reassuring smile, "welcome to the team." The moment felt surreal, almost dreamlike to her. Her breath caught as she stared at his outstretched hand. A dozen thoughts flooded her mind at once: disbelief, gratitude, joy. The world around her seemed to blur. The tall windows, the polished wood, even the Chicago skyline fading into the background. All she could see was the man before her, the CEO who had disguised himself as a janitor, leader who had seen something in her no one else had. Her fingers trembled as she lifted her hand and placed it in his, the handshake sealing something far greater than just a job offer. Tears spilled freely down Lily's cheeks, though she quickly brushed them away, embarrassed by her display of emotion. I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice breaking. Richard's smile widened slightly, his eyes twinkling with both kindness and wisdom. "Say yes," he replied warmly, his tone light but filled with meaning. That was all she needed to hear. A shaky laugh escaped her lips as she nodded vigorously. "Yes," she said, her voice steadier now. "Yes, thank you. I won't let you down." Her words were a promise from the heart. The handshake lingered a moment longer, and Richard gave her hand a firm, reassuring squeeze before releasing it. "I know you won't," he said with quiet conviction. For a moment, silence filled the room, but it wasn't the heavy, nerve-wracking silence of earlier. It was lighter, full of possibility, filled with the unspoken acknowledgement of a door opening. Richard returned to his chair, but his gaze stayed on Lily, not as a candidate, but as someone he already considered part of the company's story. Lily inhaled deeply, finally allowing herself to smile through the last of her tears. When she stepped out of the conference room, the atmosphere in the waiting area shifted instantly. Every other candidate looked up, eyes narrowing with curiosity and expectation. They had seen countless applicants go in and emerge pale-faced, discouraged, some fighting back tears. They were waiting for the same sign from Lily. But instead of defeat, she carried something entirely different. Her smile was radiant, her eyes glowing with a quiet strength that filled the room. The secretary raised her brows in subtle surprise, sensing the change in energy. For the others it was confusing, even unsettling, but undeniably striking. One man in a crisp black suit leaned forward, whispering sharply to another candidate beside him. What's she smiling about? Must have cracked under pressure. A woman in designer heels crossed her arms tightly, glaring at Lily with narrowed eyes. But Lily paid no attention. She clutched her folder to her chest, feeling lighter than she ever had before. Every step toward the elevator was filled with quiet triumph. She didn't need to explain. She didn't need to prove herself to those who doubted her. The truth was already sealed inside that room with Richard Hayes, and that truth had changed everything. As she waited for the elevator doors to open, Lily's mind replayed the entire journey, the spilled bucket, the paper towels, the way she hadn't hesitated to help. She thought of her mother back home, tirelessly working double shifts just to keep food on the table, always telling her, kindness costs nothing, but it can mean everything. Her mother had been right all along. That single act of kindness, small and instinctive, had shifted the entire course of her life. A soft laugh escaped her lips as she whispered under her breath, "Mom, you won't believe this." Back in the conference room, Richard remained seated for a moment, staring at the door Lily had just walked through. He leaned back, his hands clasped loosely in his lap, a contemplative expression settling on his face. He had interviewed hundreds, maybe thousands, of candidates over the years. He had seen the polished speeches, the carefully rehearsed answers, the resumes stacked with accomplishments. But rarely did he see something as simple, as raw, as genuine as what Lily had shown him that day. For Richard, it was a reminder of why he had built this company the way he had. He remembered the early days of his own career, when he had been dismissed by people who looked only at the surface, his old car, his worn suit, the way he spoke. He had promised himself then that if he ever had the chance to lead, he would look deeper. And now, sitting in his office, decades later, he felt that promise fulfilled. True leaders, he believed, don't just build businesses, they recognize character. They lift up those who deserve a chance, not because of what they wear or what they own, but because of who they truly are. Meanwhile, as Lily exited the building and stepped into the cool Chicago air, her heart felt lighter than it had in years. The towering skyscrapers no longer loomed over her with intimidation, but seemed to rise beside her, echoing her newfound hope. She walked past the rows of taxis, past the people rushing along the sidewalks, each carrying their own silent battles. But Lily walked differently now, shoulders straight, eyes lifted, every step charged with a quiet confidence she had never felt before. The weight of years of doubt seemed to fall away, leaving only the glow of possibility. On the train ride home, she sat by the window, watching the city blur past. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag as her mind wandered to the future. She imagined telling her family, imagined the look on her younger brother's face. When she said she had been hired, imagined the relief in her mother's tired eyes. But more than anything, she thought of the lesson etched into her heart that day. Kindness is the strongest qualification of all. It wasn't just a phrase to her now, it was her truth, her foundation, the reason she had been chosen. The train slowed as it reached her stop, and Lily rose with a determination she hadn't felt in years. As she stepped off onto the platform, she realized that this was only the beginning. The job wasn't just a paycheck, it was a chance to build something greater, to honor her family, to prove to herself that she was capable of more than she had ever believed. She smiled softly, the words of Richard Hayes replaying in her mind. We can teach skills, but we can't teach compassion. She carried those words with her, like a shield and a promise for the future. That evening, when she walked through the front door of her modest apartment, the air was filled with the smell of her mother's cooking. Her younger brother looked up from the couch, his homework spread out in front of him. "Lily, how did it go?" he asked eagerly, his eyes wide with hope. Her mother stepped out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, concern etched into her tired features. For a moment, Lily stood there, letting the anticipation build, savoring the sweetness of the moment. Then, with a smile that lit up the room, she said softly, "I got it." The room erupted with joy. Her brother leaped from the couch, throwing his arms around her waist. Her mother's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of pride, not worry. She cupped Lily's face in her hands, whispering, "I knew you could. Do it, my girl." The small apartment seemed to glow brighter, filled with laughter and relief. That night, they sat together at the worn dining table, sharing a meal that tasted different, richer somehow. It wasn't just food. It was the taste of hope, of new beginnings, of a future that suddenly felt wide open. For Lily, that day marked a turning point she would never forget. She had walked into the company lobby uncertain of her worth, doubting her chances, weighed down by years of hardship. She walked out not only with a job, but with a lesson that would guide her for the rest of her life. Kindness has power. It opens doors that credentials alone never can. It touches hearts in ways that leave lasting marks. And sometimes, when least expected, it changes everything. As she drifted to sleep that night, Lily knew she had been given not just an opportunity, but a calling. And for Richard Hayes, it was equally unforgettable. In his decades of leadership, he had seen how ambition could cloud judgment, how polished facades often hid shallow intentions. But Lily reminded him that there were still people who carried honesty, humility, and kindness at their core. She reignited in him a faith he feared was fading. That day reaffirmed his belief that building a great company wasn't about money or accolades, but about people with heart, people who cared. And as he closed his office that evening, Richard knew he hadn't just hired an employee. He had welcomed a future leader.